Hi, Made by Sue here, and today I'm making a quilt block called the King's Crown quilt block. And this is a larger block than I usually make. This one will measure 16.5 inches after you've pieced it together and finish in your quilt project at 16 inches square. The block is constructed with a large center square, 4 corner squares, and 8 half square triangle patches. And it comes out with this really cool square and a diamond feature. And this is a great block if you have some fabric with a large print that you don't really want to cut up into small pieces. So you can feature that as your focus. For the cutting instructions, and I cut all these off camera to save time, and it's just tedious to show me cutting fabric. But you'll be cutting for one block 13 separate pieces, and I just wanted to show you all the pieces together right here. And now I'll show individually exactly what you need to cut. And I'm using a little bit of a different colorway for the demonstration today. I'm using a different fabric for my center and a different fabric for the corners, just to kind of show you a different look for the block. For your center square, you'll cut 1 at 8.5 inches square. And for your corners, cut 4 at 4.5 inches square. And for the half square triangle patches, you want 1 darker fabric, 1 lighter fabric, and you'll be cutting 4 of each fabric at 5 inches square. To construct the half square triangle patches, begin with your 5-inch squares, your dark and your light. And on the back of the light fabric, and this is a batik, so it's kind of hard to tell which is the front and which is the back. But anyway, on the back of your lighter colored fabric, draw a line from one corner to the other. And I like to use just a fine point pen. And then repeat that on the 3 remaining lighter colored fabrics. And place these right sides together, 1 light and 1 dark. And I like to just give it a little pin to keep that in place. And I'll repeat it on the other 3. Now I'll take these to the machine and I'll sew 1/4 inch on each side of my drawn line. I have my 1/4 inch presser foot, I have my leader fabric, and I have my first set all ready to sew, and I have my other one sitting right next to my sewing machine. So again, 1/4 inch seam allowance, just feed that right through. I'll feed the next one in, and I'll continue till I have all 4 of my sets sewn. Now I'll turn them around and sew on the other side of my line. Now I'll clip these apart, take them over to the cutting area, and I'll be cutting them apart on my drawn line. Now you have 2 half square triangles. I'll set those aside. I'll continue cutting and meet you at the pressing area. When pressing these units, press 4 of them to the dark and 4 to the light. So basically all that means is start with, if you're pressing toward the dark, start with the dark on top. Set the seam, finger press, and press. And that is pressing toward the dark. So you'll do 4 that way and then 4 pressing toward the light. So start with your light fabric on top. And press. So again, 4 toward the light and 4 toward the dark, and that'll just help later when we're piecing the block together. To square up these half square triangles, I want to square them up to 4.5 inches square. I'm using my Quilt in a Day ruler. You can use, of course, any square up ruler that you like. First of all, matching up my seam line, my diagonal seam line, to the diagonal line on my ruler. And I want to make sure this line and this line is right, and it makes a nice corner. And the first thing you want to do is have a little bit of fabric beyond each side of the 4.5 inch mark, and you can see the 4.5 inch mark right here. Once you have it all lined up, I'll go ahead and trim off here and here. And it's important to really hold this ruler firmly so it doesn't shift when you're making your cuts. 1, 2. Then move your block around so the opposite color is on top. Do the same thing, line up your diagonal line. This time I will make sure that here and here, where I previously made my cuts, lines up to exactly 4.5 inches. And still make sure this is lined up, your diagonal line. You have a perfectly squared up half square triangle patch. I'll go ahead and square the remainder off camera. I have my half square triangle patches done, my center and my corners. Now the fun part is to place them to make the block. And to sew it together, I like to start with piecing the half square triangles together. So right sides together. I'll place a pin where I want to sew. So this just indicates where I begin and the direction that I want to sew. And this is just a rough pin. I'll line them up more carefully at the sewing machine. Okay, I'll take these to the sewing machine and I will sew a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance right along here. One thing I forgot to mention when you're pairing your half square triangle patches together, make sure that you have one patch that was pressed toward the light and one that was pressed toward the dark. So at this point you'll have one seam allowance going in this direction and then the other going in the opposite direction, and that just simply makes less bulk. So maybe you can see it better here. This one's here and this one's on this side. And now I'll carefully align my patches. And then I'll make sure I'm still pinning in the direction I want to sew so I don't get confused. And at the bottom I'll do another pin. You don't have to. But just for my sake, just so I keep it lined up nicely. And I'll repeat that off camera with my other patches. And so now I'll sew a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance right down here. And clip apart. Set your seam. Finger press. And here you just want to give it a double check that you have a nice 1/4 inch seam right here. And that'll be important when you're piecing together your project, wherever you decide to use this. Now put these back in their places. And I'll look at this as rows, so I'll piece together the center and then each side. Again, pin in the direction that I want to begin sewing and the direction I'm going in. I'll take it to the machine, and off camera I will sew a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. I have my rows pieced. Now I just wanted to show you really quickly. Make sure that you press your outside rows toward the outside. For example, you would set the seam and then press toward the outside, so toward that corner. And do that on each end. Set the seam. And then the center, you want to press just the opposite. You want to press not toward the outside, but toward that center. So therefore I'll have the center on top. Press that. And then finger press. And press. That way your seam allowances will be going in the opposite directions when you go to piece this together. So you have this one on this side and this seam allowance on that side. The last thing I need to do is attach my sides to the center, so right sides together. You can see my seam is a little wonky here, so I'll probably give that a little press before I sew. But the important thing here is to match up these seams right here. So here you would carefully pin, nestle these seams together, and pin And repeat that with your other seam. And then I'll go right ahead and pin this side, right sides together. I will take it to the machine. I will sew again, a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance along here and along here. I went ahead and pressed that seam down just to make it easier for when I'm sewing. And it's all pinned, and I'll just match up the beginning. And I'll just keep checking as I go. And these long seams I tend to sew pretty slowly. And I'm coming up to my pin, my first pin. And again, just keep checking my alignment. Try to get up a little bit closer to my pin. It's being a little finicky right here. But just do your best to make sure these ends really meet up nicely. And I'll check my seams to see if they matched up. That looks good. There's my first one. Looks good. So I will sew the other side off camera just to save a little bit of time. Here's the final measure, 16.5 inches square, and it just barely is 16.5 inches. So I really recommend using your scant 1/4 inch seam allowance when piecing this block together.